Yo, what is up, everybody? Thoresco back again with the zombie apocalypse story for you guys. This one is titled 50 Days After the Apocalypse, written by Rupert Rollinson. Hopefully you guys have been enjoying the previous stories. Remember to use the links in the description, show love to the author, like, comment, and subscribe. Chapter 1, Day 1. Moore College, a small co-ed school located in the northwest of England, about 30 miles from the nearest city. The school could almost be considered famous for not being famous. Constant mediocre marks, and one footballer whose career ended over a decade ago. But this tiny school of underachievers and overreachers housed two seemingly ordinary students who would come to be instrumental in the events that followed. The last bell finally rang, signaling the end of a long lesson and an even longer day. Roughly shoving her books into a shoulder bag, quickly followed by a few pens and a ruler, a girl stood up from her desk and threw her bag over her shoulder. She made her way over to a quickly forming group of 6 others in the center of the room. The girl stood at a little under 6 foot, with a thin figure emphasizing flexibility and agility. Her blonde hair was tied back in a ponytail for efficiency while still looking smart. A stray strand of hair hung uncorrected over her pretty face in a way most considered cute. But her defining feature was her bright emerald eyes that sparkled in the light, giving her an aura of innocence. Joining the group, the girl proceeded to hop onto a nearby desk, listening to the conversation. Stood at the very center of the circle was a tall, well-built boy with cropped black hair. How do they expect us to stay awake on a day like this when the lessons are that dull? Can I borrow your notes again, Amy? Reaching into the bag by her side, the girl, Amy, handed over an A4 book, replying exasperately. Ben, if you don't start working soon, you're gonna fail your A levels. I won't fail, babe. Really? How did you do in your mocks, huh? One of the other guys in the group asked. Ben went red with embarrassment, muttering a feeble excuse while the rest of the gang burst out laughing. As the laughter slowly died away, Ben tried to recover some credibility by stating, "Come on, I do more work than John." That doesn't count. That weirdo's like some genius, isn't he? Amy didn't bother listening to the response. Instead, she allowed her attention to drift over to the boy they were referring teachers. He sat secluded in a corner of the classroom, leaning back in his chair, apparently sleeping. His straight brown hair was neatly cut through a few strands that were long enough to cover his right eye. As the group had said, he was smart. The trouble was, he knew it. The boy barely paid attention in lessons, and he damn near ignored anyone, be it a teacher, a student, that asked him a question. Everyone got the message. Don't bother me, and I won't bother you. The teachers didn't care, so long as he continued to top the tests to the students His behavior demanded ostracization anyway. As if he sensed her looking at him, John opened his eyes and stared back at the girl. Amy broke the eye contact, quickly turning to her attention back to her friends. Jane, didn't you used to play hockey with him? Yeah, a few years ago. Then he stopped because it interfered with some camping thing. It was clear by the look on her face that she did not like being affiliated with the social outcast. Oh, come on. Enough talk about the weirdo. We need to set off. Y'all are coming to the match, right? The others of the group followed his example, the guys grabbing their sports kits. Afraid I can't come. Mom's working late tonight, so I've got to walk home, Amy responded, jumping off the desk she had been perched on and made her way out, in a hurry to start the long walk ahead of her. The group shouted goodbyes after her while Ben quickly caught up to her, took her hand. When Amy looked at him questioningly, Ben smiled back at her, saying, "Hey, what kind of boyfriend would I be if I didn't at least walk you out?" The two walked through the emptying school, Ben talking animatedly about the match ahead, while Amy remained silent, content to listen. As the couple left the building and made their way to the school gates, Ben pulled Amy to one side. "Are you sure you don't want me to walk you back?" "I'll be fine now. Go to the match and score a goal for me, okay?" Ben brightened up at that, kissing Amy on the cheek. He jogged off towards the pitches, shouting over his shoulder, "I'll see you on Monday." Amy waved at his retreating figure before putting on a set of headphones and hitting play on her iPod. The long walk home was quiet and uneventful for the most part. Amy hummed along to songs while she weaved through pedestrians and darted down alleys. She loved walking, a love sadly not shared by her family or friends. Something in the dull, rhythmic feeling of her steps spoke to her nature, and Amy would just lose herself in it. However, as the winter sun started to dip below the horizon, Amy came face to face with the thing that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was about 10 minutes away from home, and she decided to take a shortcut down a nearby alley. Unfortunately, there was already someone in the alley. A man, around 40, and his balding head shone with some of the light of the setting sun. The man blocked their path, wheezing at the girl. Amy initially dismissed him as a drunk. She tried to maneuver around him, only to suddenly fall back, terrified, as the man lunged at her. Amy retreated quickly, deciding on the only sane option: run. With that idea firmly in her head, Amy sprinted out the alley the way she had come, running all the way home. In the coming months, when Amy remembered this moment, she would have one thought. If I had known what was about to happen, what I was about to experience, I probably would have let him kill me, then have to deal with the horrors that were here follow. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of chapter 1. Yo, what is up, everybody? Resco back again with another chapter from the story titled 50 Days After the Apocalypse, written by Rupert Rollinson. Remember to use the link in the descriptions below. Show love to the author, like, comment, and subscribe. Chapter 2, Day 0. Amy slowly drifted into consciousness, thankful that she didn't set an alarm on Saturday mornings. Suddenly, she bolted upright as there was a loud crash from downstairs, followed by the terrifying sounds of her mother screaming. Without thinking, Amy jumped out of bed, rushing downstairs to see a scene ripped straight from her nightmares. Her father was twitching on the floor, foaming at the mouth, a huge chunk of his shoulder missing as if bitten out by an animal. Her mother was trying to fend off a male attacker. Her left arm hung limply at her side, while she brandished a bloody kitchen knife in her right. Amy watched as the attacker charged towards her mother, who stabbed out with their weapon in a blind panic. The blade plunged to the man's chest, but the man continued on, unfazed, pinning the woman against the wall. Amy listened in horror as her mom screamed, yelling at her daughter for help. For a moment, Amy stood still as she tried to process what was happening. Then the creature's teeth clamped down on her mother's neck, splaying blood around the room. Amy's mind broke, and she ran straight out of the open front door as fast as she could. In her terrified state, Amy barely noticed the devastation around her. She just ran in a blind panic until she ran straight into the back of someone, falling to the floor. Dazed and still in shock, Amy looked up at who she had run into. Towering over her, Ben stared down at his girlfriend with clouded eyes as he reached out a hand to her. In that moment, Amy believed that she just took his hand. This horrible nightmare would be over. Slowly, with a trembling hand, the girl made to grab her girl boyfriend's hand. That was when she noticed a huge bite on his left arm. Her panic returned, and Amy crawled backwards on her hands. Ben followed her step by step, his hand still slowly reaching out, trying to grab her. Amy's back hit a wall. He dragged her legs, terrified. Ben stood over her, his hand mere inches away. The girl closed her eyes and waited for the end to come. A liquid splashed across Amy's face, followed by a loud thump next to her. Slowly opening her eyes, Amy saw she was covered in blood, and lying next to her was Ben's body, his head caved in. Standing in its place was John, dressed in a white t-shirt, splattered with blood, and walking trousers and hiking boots. A bag slung over his back, and a bloody hockey stick grasped tightly in both hands. "Were you bitten?" Amy didn't respond, and he yelled at her again. "Were you bitten?" Amy numbly shook her head. John looked around again. Look, we can't stay here. Which way to your house? Amy gave a slight nod in the direction she had come from. John made to grab her arm, but Amy flinched and tried to push herself further into the wall. For a moment, John's eyes softened as he said, it's okay. I haven't been bitten. Then, he lightly took her by the hand and pulled Amy to her feet. Amy slowly came back to her senses as John led her through the streets back to her house. The scene could have been from a horror film. Bodies littered the streets. Many had the creatures crouched next to them. The sickening munching sound that could be heard near them almost made Amy vomit. There were cars all over the road. Some had been left abandoned, while others were broken, some overturned, and glass scattered across the street. The houses were the worst. Each house was damaged in some way. Some simply had broken windows, while others had their doors splintered. In all cases, there was one unifying factor: blood. Whether pooled on the floor or smeared against the walls, in every house, blood could be seen. After a while, Amy finally convinced herself to look at the creatures themselves. All of them had the same vacant expression. Their mouths twisted into a snarl, and they had hideous wounds that left a trail of blood in their wake. One of the things stumbled towards the two, but John raised his arms and smashed it in the head with his hockey stick. Why aren't more attacking us? Amy asked. There's easier prey about than the two of us. And Johnny grunted, pointing his weapon as a small 10-year-old ran across the street. Amy stopped and watched in horror as a child was suddenly swarmed by 5 of the things. A few blood-curdling screams of terror could be heard before the same sickening punching. John pulled her hand, signaling that they needed to start moving again. Amy zoned out again, allowing herself to be led around, only speaking when John asked her for direction. She only came to her senses when John stopped. Looking around, Amy realized they had arrived to her house. That was when Amy saw the front window was smashed in and the front door was still wide open from when the girl had run out through it. Amy moved behind John in fear, remembering what had happened to her parents. John made a disgruntled sound before dropping Amy's hand and throwing his rucksack to the ground as he grabbed the frying pan, which was strapped to the side, gave it to the terrifying girl, saying, "Look, use this to defend yourself." Amy then whispered something which he couldn't make out. Turning to her, John, so she could say it again. "Look, I can't go back there. I left him to die. I left my mom alone with that thing." John turned his back to her, saying, "Tough. I need some help and we need to get at some things in your house. So look, face your fear and follow me." With that, John walked towards the entrance. Amy stood still, trying to decide what to do. She could run again. She had a weapon now, and she knew how to kill the things. But this man had saved her. He was helping her now. Could she just leave him to go in there alone? As Amy struggled with the decision, her father ran out of the door. John raised his stick again, only for Amy to instinctively grab it to defend father. The boy quickly shook her grip off, but it was too late. The man lunged at him, mouth open, ready to clamp down Prey's neck. John was quick though, and managed to get his stick between himself and his attacker. The two tumbled to the ground, the father's teeth centimeters the boy's neck. Amy watched as the two rolled around on the ground where the man pinned John beneath him, arching its back and baring his teeth, ready to bite the boy. Amy finally acted, swinging the frying pan around and into her father's shoulder, knocking him off her companion. John scrambled to his feet while the man was slower, giving the boy time to raise his stick. This time, Amy didn't stop him as the weapon descended, slamming to the older man's face. He could only watch as her father's body went limp. Collapsing to her knees, Amy stared blankly at her dad's face that was fixed for all eternity, a blank snarl. Eventually, she clambered to her feet, looking over at John, who was bent over, trying to catch his breath. Thanks. Amy's state of mind was chaotic. Lots of thoughts jostled for supremacy. Before John tapped her on the shoulder, dragging her back into reality, he said, "We're not done yet," said, walking inside, aiming, following, weapon raised. Upon passing through the doorway, the two companions saw Amy's mother. She was in a terrible state. Multiple bites could be seen all over her body, probably due to her struggles. Possibly the hardest to look at was her face, where a bite had scraped the skin away, leaving only a mess of blood and bone. The blank eye settled on the pair, and the unusual snarl appeared. Amy started to freeze up again as the memories of the morning all came flooding back. Her mother's cries, her boyfriend's face before he died, her father attacking her. John slipped behind her, laying a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's already dead, Amy. It's in front of you, twisted shadow. The only way you can harm her now is allowing that thing to continue walk the earth. So, do the right thing. Kill it yourself." As if responding to John's words, the mother lurched forwards, her movement hindered by the wounds she had received. Amy moved forward and raised her frying pan. But she couldn't do it. How could she harm her own mother? Thankfully, Amy was suddenly tackled to the ground. Twisting over, she saw the man that had started all of this was now crouched over, ready to bite her. Acting on instinct and using reflexes she never knew she had, Amy brought the head of the pan between her and the attacker's mouth. As she pushed her arms out, pushing the thing's head away, only to have her right arm grabbed and pinned to the floor, sending the frying pan sliding away. The strength of the man was incredible. Even his grip seemed like it could snap her, too. Amy began to panic as its mouth came within centimeters of her. So close to her, she could feel its breath. The chunks of flesh she could only assume to be her parents. John's hockey stick suddenly slammed into the creature's chest, sending it rolling away, wheezing. Spinning on his heel, John smacked the head of the hockey stick through the temple of the thing that had once been Amy's mother. John reached a hand down, grabbing Amy's arm and pulling her to her feet. I guess it was too much to ask for you to kill your own mother as a start, huh? That one though, I know you'd kill. It was true now that the thing was not almost killing her. Amy felt her anger at the creature rise as she thought of everything that had happened to her parents, to Ben, and to everyone else on the God-forsaken planet. And she blamed it all on the one thing in front of her. Amy took the hockey stick and raised it above her head as she charged forwards, bringing the bloody tip down through the snarling face, driving it back to the floor. But he didn't stop with one hit. Filled with anger, Amy raised the weapon again before slamming it down. Again and again, she struck the corpse even after her hands went numb, even after she couldn't see through the tears, even after the body was no longer recognizable. Then, as she raised the stick again, T-shirt John grabbed it, halting its progress. Amy turned fire in her eyes, but the boy wrapped his other arm around her, pulling her into a tight hug. Amy stopped and watched in horror as the child was suddenly swarmed by 5 of the things. A few blood-curdling screams of terror could be heard before the same sickening punching. John pulled her hand, signaling that they needed to start moving again. Amy zoned out again, allowing herself to be led around, only speaking when John asked her for direction. She only came to her senses when John stopped. Looking around, Amy realized they had arrived to her house. That was when Amy saw the front window was smashed in and the front door was still wide open from when the girl had run out through it. Amy moved behind John in fear, remembering what had happened to her parents. John made a disgruntled sound before dropping Amy's hand and throwing his rucksack to the ground as he grabbed the frying pan, which was strapped to the side, gave it to the terrifying girl, saying, "Look, use this to defend yourself." Amy then whispered something which he couldn't make out. Turning to her, John, so she could say it again. "Look, I can't go back there. I left him to die. I left my mom alone with that thing." John turned his back to her, saying, "Tough. I need some help and we need to get at some things in your house. So look, face your fear and follow me." With that, John walked towards the entrance. Amy stood still, trying to decide what to do. She could run again. She had a weapon now, and she knew how to kill the things. But this man had saved her. He was helping her now. Could she just leave him to go in there alone? As Amy struggled with the decision, her father ran out of the door. John raised his stick again, only for Amy to instinctively grab it to defend father. The boy quickly shook her grip off, but it was too late. The man lunged at him, mouth open, ready to clamp down Prey's neck. John was quick though, and managed to get his stick between himself and his attacker. The two tumbled to the ground, the father's teeth centimeters the boy's neck. Amy watched as the two rolled around on the ground where the man pinned John beneath him, arching its back and baring its teeth, ready to bite the boy. Amy finally acted, swinging the frying pan around and into her father's shoulder, knocking him off her companion. John scrambled to his feet while the man was slower, giving the boy time to raise his stick. This time, Amy didn't stop him, as the weapon descended, slamming to the older man's face. She could only watch as her father's body went limp. Collapsing to her knees, Amy stared blankly at her dad's face that was fixed for all eternity, a blank snarl. Eventually, she clambered to her feet, looking over at John, who was bent over, trying to catch his breath. Thanks. Amy's state of mind was chaotic. Lots of thoughts jostled for supremacy. Before John tapped her on the shoulder, dragging her back into reality, he said, "We're not done yet," said, walking inside, aiming following, weapon raised. Upon passing through the doorway, the two companions saw Amy's mother. She was in a terrible state. Multiple bites could be seen all over her body, probably due to her struggles. Possibly the hardest to look at was her face, where a bite had scraped the skin away, leaving only a mess of blood and bone. The blank eye settled on the pair, and the unusual snarl appeared. Amy started to freeze up again as the memories of the morning all came flooding back. Her mother's cries, her boyfriend's face before he died, her father attacking her. John slipped behind her, laying a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's already dead, Amy. It's in front of you, twisted shadow. The only way you can harm her now is allowing that thing to continue walk the earth. So, do the right thing. Kill it yourself." As if responding to John's words, the mother lurched forwards, her movement hindered by the wounds she had received. Amy moved forward and raised her frying pan. But she couldn't do it. How could she harm her own mother? Thankfully, Amy was suddenly tackled to the ground. Twisting over, she saw the man that had started all of this was now crouched over, ready to bite her. Acting on instinct and using reflexes she never knew she had, Amy brought the head of the pan between her and the attacker's mouth. As she pushed her arms out, pushing the thing's head away, only to have her right arm grabbed and pinned to the floor, sending the frying pan sliding away. The strength of the man was incredible. Even his grip seemed like it could snap her, too. Amy began to panic as his mouth came within centimeters of her. So close to her, she could feel its breath. The chunks of flesh she could only assume to be her parents. John's hockey stick suddenly slammed into the creature's chest, sending it rolling away, wheezing. Spinning on his heel, John smacked the head of the hockey stick through the temple of the thing that had once been Amy's mother. John reached a hand down, grabbing Amy's arm and pulling her to her feet. I guess it was too much to ask for you to kill your own mother as a start, huh? That one though, I know you could kill. It was true now that the thing was not almost killing her. Amy felt her anger at the creature rise as she thought of everything that had happened to her parents, to Ben, and to everyone else on the God-forsaken planet. And she blamed it all on the one thing in front of her. Amy took the hockey stick and raised it above her head as she charged forwards, bringing the bloody tip down through the snarling face, driving it back to the floor. But he didn't stop with one hit. Filled with anger, Amy raised the weapon again before slamming it down. Again and again, she struck the corpse even after her hands went numb. Even after she couldn't see through the tears. Even after the body was no longer recognizable. Then, as she raised the stick again, T-shirt John grabbed it, halting its progress. Amy turned fire in her eyes, but the boy wrapped his other arm around her, pulling her into a tight hug. Remember that feeling. Remember each one of those infected is like that thing. Every time one of them comes near you, remember that feeling and treat them the exact same way. Upon hearing John's words, Amy let go of the hockey stick, beginning to cry to John's shirt. Then, couldn't hold it in anymore. Wheeling away from her companion, Amy crouched down and threw up. Amy let out a sigh when the water sprayed over her as the shower turned on. After Amy had recovered her composure enough to stop retching, John had sent her upstairs, shower stating it would be the last one she could have for a long time. A light banging sound echoed up the stairs. Amy was sure that it was probably John doing something. She lacked the motivation to think of what it could be. Amy wasn't sure how long she stood in the shower. She was just eager to feel anything except this numbness. It was only when she was blasted by cold water that she realized she had used all the hot water. Stepping out of the water, she observed with a grim detachment that her hands still had some blood on them, though she was unable to say who it was. After toweling herself dry, Amy dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans. Slowly descending the stairs, she saw John sat by the food cupboards, forming two piles of food. As she walked into the kitchen, Amy noticed that several of the floorboards had been torn out and used to repair the broken door and window. "What are you doing?" she asked as she took a seat at the food counter. Just gathering supplies. We don't want to starve for the next few weeks." "Will it take that long? I mean, surely the government will set up like safe camps in the next few days where we can live." "Don't be an idiot." "Well, sorry. I'm a little new to this whole apocalypse thing. So why don't you explain it since you clearly have so much more experience?" "Look, if you gather all the survivors in an area together and put them in a dense place, chances are one of them will be infected. In a tightly packed area like a camp, there's only going to be one outcome: a bloodbath." Amy opened her mouth to respond, but she couldn't find any fault in the logic. That scared her almost as much as the dead. And John continued on, ignoring the girl's mental struggle. "Also, we don't know how the infected hunt, and if they smell you out thin by gathering together, all you do is attract all the infected in the area." John then ordered Amy to go find the weapon and some sort of bag. Frustrated at her companion's tight lips, Amy stood up and set about her task, eager to put as much distance between her and her mother's corpse as possible. Eventually, her search brought her to the attic. Letting a small smile creep into her face, she had always been scared of going into the attic. Her reasons seemed petty now, considering what was happening outside. The room was dark. The bulb had been broken over 3 years ago, and no one had bothered to change it. From what little she could make out, Amy could see a lot of cobwebs connecting most of the beams. Just as she was about to go back down to John, her eyes fell upon her father's old cricket bag from when he had been caught in his midlife crisis and had decided he was going to become one of the best cricketers in the world, or at least in the town. Crawling forwards so as to avoid the majority of the webs, Amy pulled the bag towards her. It was a simple large bag with one long zip running across it and 2 straps that allowed it to be carried or worn like a backpack. Unzipping the forgotten bag, Amy unpacked most of the equipment before her hand grasped the handle of the bat. A big solid wooden bat, she supposed that it was as good as a weapon as she was likely to find in this house. Amy grabbed the supposed empty bag, but as she lifted it, small rattling inside caused her to stop, check the bag. Hidden at the bottom of the bag was a small photo in a frame, a large crack in the glass. Lifting up the small photo, Amy realized it was a family photo taken from a holiday a few years ago. Memories flooded the girl's mind, and tears began to fall, unbidden, down her cheek. "Oh, no, not again," Amy whispered as she tried not to cry. He wasn't going to become the type of person that was always needed protecting. She was going to protect herself. Slowly regaining her composure, Amy wiped the tears from her face and placed the picture back into her father's bag before zipping it up and going back to the kitchen. When Amy walked down into the kitchen, seeing that John had already packed one of the piles of food away, the other pile of food he was in the process of covering, each object in fabrics and plastic bags, so as multiple. When he glanced up at her, John motioned for Amy to put the bag next to him before he returned, covering the objects. Sliding the bag across the floor, Amy again took a seat at the counter. John started throwing in the muffled items collected from all over the house, while Amy was thankful that he didn't say anything about the photo. He did have to admit it was creepy when he produced a spare set of her clothes. It was 3 o'clock by the time John was satisfied he had stripped the house clean of anything useful. Handing Amy her now full cricket bag as John prepared to leave. Walking over to the door, John quickly used the hammer to pull the screws from the floorboards, blocking the door. I still don't understand why we should set off now. Though she was not eager to stay in her house with the corpses, it did seem rather foolish to be setting off now with only a few hours of light remaining. John quickly glanced at her while he picked up his hockey stick and put his hammer in his bag. Look, it's best for now to avoid the most populated areas. It's likely that's where the infected are going to congregate. Over the first few days at least. Anyways, ready to go? And Amy merely picked up her cricket bat in response. Like that, the two stole off into the waning light. Skirting her father's body, they began to walk towards the edge of town. The street had even more of the infected roaming it than when Amy had last fled her home. Though many of the fires that had burned when the two had first met at the start of this frightful day had now been reduced to cinders. Readying herself for what was bound to be a long and bloody fight, Amy quickly took one last glance at her home for the past 18 years. It wasn't the home she had grown up in anymore. Now, it was just another shattered house that had seen too much death in the past day. Then, turning back on the house, she hurried off after her companion. Around the world, governments toppled as humans fell on themselves in a fit of anger and distrust. This was the day the old world ended, and this is the day where our story truly begins. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of chapter 2. Yo, what is up, everybody? Resco back again with another chapter from the story titled 50 Days After the Apocalypse, written by Rupert Rollingson. Remember to use the links in the description below. Show love to the author, like, comment, and subscribe. Chapter 3. Time trickled by at a snail's pace, but slowly the light of dawn began to filter through the boards covering the broken windows. Checking the digital watch, Amy rose to her feet, stretching as she did in an attempt to remove the stiffness from her limbs. Looking down at herself in the new light of the day, the girl saw her blood-covered clothes, momentarily distracted by the way the coating would crack as she moved. Amy thought back on the events of yesterday after the pair had left their house. John had dragged the girl from one house to another, teaching her how to board up doors and windows, as well as how to efficiently search a house for supplies. But the main thing the girl had learned yesterday was how to fight. The infected were everywhere, clogging up the streets and waiting to ambush them in every house. In just one day, Amy had almost died over half a dozen times, and she was sure it would have been a lot more if not for her quiet companion. Amy's attention drifted over to her companion. Only John's head protruded from his sleeping bag as it rested on a rolled up jumper that acted as a pillow. Filled with envy at the man's restful sleep, Amy looked down at the watch. 6:50. 10 minutes before she was supposed to wake him. After another jealous look at the man, and Amy decided he had enough sleep. Stealthily moving over to John, the girl reached to his side without waking him. While she was sure she would have been killed without him, there was still a part of her that felt the man could have been a little more compassionate. In fact, any compassion would have been nice. Deciding to get a little bit of revenge on her companion, Amy brought her foot back and gave John a light but sharp kick inside. John grunted as he woke up, hands struggling to find the zipper on his sleeping bag, his expression a mixture of anger and shock. If it weren't for the threat of attack by the infected, Amy would have burst out laughing. And after a few good seconds, the man came to his senses. Looking at Amy questioningly, he finally freed himself from the bag. "Time to get up," Amy said in the sweetest voice you could muster, before moving over to one of the upturned chairs and righting it. As she sat down, the girl made sure that her bat was in arm's reach and her chair was pointing in the direction of the door. Shortly after, John followed her, dragging over his rucksack as he mirrored Amy's action. Rooting through the pack, John pulled out 2 cans of beans, which he quickly cut the lids off with one of his knives. Momentarily confused, Amy looked around for a form of heating the contents before she realized what was about to happen. "You've got to be kidding," he exclaimed in a deadpan voice as John slid one of the freezing cold cans over to her. The man merely smiled at her as he dug out a spork and began to dig through his can. Amy sat there for a few seconds before giving in and asking, "Don't I get one?" John looked at her, a gleam in his eye, and a sadistic smile on his face, as he said, in a sickly sweet voice, "Sorry, I only packed one." Amy had to restrain herself from kicking him again, as she looked down at the congealed contents of the can. Honestly, looked like sick, and it didn't smell much better. But a sudden grumble from her stomach settled things for her. Slowly lifting the can to her lips, Amy poured a quarter of it out towards her mouth. Maybe half of the falling beans actually landed in her mouth. The rest fell onto her t-shirt and legs, adding another color to the blood-stained clothing. Amy gagged at the horrible taste of the food as she struggled to swallow. Amy tried 2 more times to eat from the can, before John mercifully handed her another spork. They ate in uncomfortable silence. Amy's mind was filled with questions, but she could not ask them. As they finished their respective cans, John set about packing all the items they had left spread around the room. With that finished, he handed Amy her pack before slinging his own onto his shoulders, picking up a hockey stick. As the two approached the door, they stood silent for a moment, longer to see if they could hear any affected. Satisfied for their momentary safety, the two moved their barricade out of the way and silently stole out of the house and into the streets. The carnage of the previous day was diminished, but still evidence of it could be seen anywhere you looked. Most noticeable of these reminders were the infected that swarmed the streets, in possibly even more numbers than before. Shambling around, no distinct direction, creatures made traveling through the main roads impossible, and instead the companions struck to alleys, gardens. The tension was incredible. Knowing that with every step they risked their lives was as thrilling as it was terrifying. But possibly the most impossible thing Amy saw that day was John. The man thrived in this new world. As the hours passed, Amy's concentration began to waver, but John only became more impressive, leading the two through the town with ease, skirting large groups of infected, distracting others that impeded their route. Amy felt her respect for the man increased with every step she took. This would not last. It was long past midday, and the pair had begun to look for a safe place to make camp for the night. Then they heard it. The screaming and yells for help. Amy immediately made after them, believing her companion would follow her. It was human, after all, to want to help those in need, wasn't it? Amy raced through the streets, thankful that the areas infected seemed to be occupied somewhere else. She soon found them. The cries were coming from the doorway to the 2-story detached house. A young girl was crying in front of the open door, while a middle-aged man was fending off a group of 8 infected with a piece of plywood. Amy made a move towards the scuffle, only for John to grab her by the arm and hold her back. "What are you doing? We need to go help them." "Just wait." Amy was forced to watch as the 2 of the infected broke past the man and latched on to the screaming girl. Amy averted her gaze, but there was a sickening squelch, and then the screaming stopped. The child was gutted in seconds. The man lets loose a cry of loss as he turned around smashed the plywood over the back of the first infected's head before swinging it in an upward arc, slamming into the second's chin. The creature wheeled back, but before the man could finish it like he did the first one of the faster infected lurched towards the man, burying its teeth into its shoulder. John quickly lets Amy go and pressed a button on his watch. Then he calmly walked past his companion and asking, "Shall we save him then?" As if he was asking for her to go for a walk. But Amy brushed off her worry. Instead, she was focusing on the infected as she charged in to the back of them. The first one didn't see her coming and was an easy kill. The second one turned to her, raising an arm to swing at her, but Amy blocked it with her bat. Again, Amy was forced to marvel at the strength of the infected as the bat was almost driven from her hands. Almost. Amy used the block to push forwards and throw the monster off balance. Before it could recover, Amy brained it. Using the brief respite Kill offered her, Amy looked around to see John had killed 3 of the infected, leaving only the one that had killed the girl and the one that had bitten the man. The 2 creatures fully concentrated on their new prey, allowing the man to feebly crawl over to the corpse of his daughter. The infected that had killed the girl charged forwards at John, who quickly sidestepped using the hockey stick to trip the monster, knocking it to the floor. Before it could get up, John raised his weapon and slammed it straight through the back of the creature's skull, killing it. Undaunted, the other infected charged at the 2 of them. John spun on his heel, swinging his hockey stick into the thing's stomach, forcing it to double over, allowing Amy to rush forwards, bat raised, finishing it with one quick strike. Amy breathed a sigh of relief as she stood there, panting. Recovering her composure, she smiled kindly at the man, cowering over the bleeding girl's body. Silently, John strode over to him. "Come with us." "Where?" "Just into the house behind you." Amy mirrored his actions, startled to see that already more infected were emerging from the surrounding houses, probably drawn by the conflict. What about my daughter? You can save her, can't you?" Before Amy could try and comfort the father over his loss, John spoke. "Move over and let me see her." The kindness in his voice immediately had Amy on edge, and she looked at her companion, not understanding his actions. The man quickly stood up and moved away from the girl's body, and Amy saw John's hand tighten on the handle of his hockey stick, and she realized too late what was about to happen. Before the 2 could react, John raised his hockey stick and slammed down on top of the dead girl's head. The father yelled in anger and made to grab John, only for the man in question to drop his hockey stick and punch the father in the face. Before the elder man could recover, John slipped behind them, grabbed the man around his neck, dragging him inside the house. Amy stood there, stunned for a second, before quickly picking up John's discarded weapon, following the two. The man fell into what appeared to be a living room, momentarily breaking them apart. John flung his backpack off and grabbed one of the knives attached to the outside of it as he scrambled to his feet. In his anger, the father charged forward, blindly unafraid, only to be stabbed just below his bitten shoulder. Yelling in pain, the man could do nothing as John forced the knife tip out of the other side of the man's body. The father swung wildly at John's face with the other hand, but was dodged, and John pushed the man backwards to the wall. John ran forward, grabbing the knife handle again as he slammed all of his weight behind it, stabbing the tip to the wall. And John gave the handle a savage twist, jamming the knife into the wall, pinning the man in place. The father made to use the other hand to pull the blade, but John grabbed it, forcing it away. Amy, give me the other knives. He called out to the woman who stood in the doorway. Amy hesitated unwillingly to join in whatever her partner was doing. Now! John shouted at her as he struggled with the man. Dropping the two weapons, Amy ran over to the discarded backpack, pulling out all three of the knives before handing it over. Amy watched as John took each one of them and stabbed the man in the same place on his other arm and one through each of his legs, just above the feet, giving each another twist to hold them there. Finally satisfied with his grim work, John moved away, riding one of the upturned chairs or taking a seat facing the man. Amy, go make sure the house is safe. Normally, Amy would have yelled at John not to order her around, but right now, she was all too happy to get the hell out of that room. The next 20 minutes, the girl searched the empty house for infected as well as barricading the outer doors and covering the windows. With nothing left to do, Amy grudgingly returned to find the man still vainly struggling to escape the knives. Silently, she strode in, grabbing a stool. She walked over to a corner. As she sat down, the man finally stopped struggling, realizing it was impossible to escape. His shoulders sank and his head dropped. After a while, the man spoke. You said you would save her, you bastard. I did. If I hadn't done that, you would have had something far worse than death waiting for her. When I get out of here, I'm gonna throttle you until I see the life leave your eyes. I'm afraid that you'll only get out of here after you've died. You're going to kill me, then just hurry up and do it. Look, I'm not gonna kill you. You're a dead man walking. Then Amy perked up at that, and she just said, John, can I talk to you for a minute? What did you mean about the bite? Look, bites are how the disease spread. Casting a glance at the pinned man, clearly eager to return his observation, but Amy wasn't done with John yet. So why have you trapped that man? An experiment, really. Amy stood to wait for John to elaborate, but he looked away, not wanting to meet Amy's eyes, as he said, "Look, I'm timing how long it takes for a bite to take over." That's stupid. I mean, you would have had to have been timing him immediately after he was, no? She didn't finish her sentence, and right then, Amy realized what had happened. Unable to stop herself, Amy spoke her thoughts. You waited for him to be bitten. You sacrificed both him and the girl just for your experiment? Yeah, I mean, why waste the perfect chance? The first slap echoed throughout the empty household. The second became more of a thud as Amy clenched her hand to a fist. John's head flew back and he staggered slightly before hitting the corridor wall. You sentenced them to death for your own gain. We could have saved them. You didn't even feel sorry, do you? Aren't you human? Amy, humanity is dead. All that is left are survivors and infected. In this new world, you looked after yourself and only yourself. Do you understand me? Amy looked at John. He had a red handprint on his left cheek, while his lip was cut from the punch. His face and body were covered in upcoming bruises from his fight with the man. Slowly, the girl asked one last question. Then why did you save me? In your new world, what possible reason was there to save me? You can't survive alone in this world. You need to sleep and need someone to watch your back. Why did you save me? You were the first person I saw. John's answer was full of regret, but it wasn't registered. Amy forcefully pulled her arm out of John's grip before walking back into the living room, sitting on her stool, looking at the captured man. John followed a few seconds after her and was tactful enough to pull his seat over to the opposite corner. The man didn't seem to register the two coming back in, or if he did, he didn't do anything about it. 20 minutes of silence passed as the man started to froth at the mouth. Half an hour later, the man slumped before he looked up. His eyes were now misted over, and he had the expression of an animal wild. There was no recognizable trait of humanity left in him, and Amy and John both stood as Amy reached for her cricket bat. What are you doing? I'm killing it. Do you not understand that we have a trapped infected here? There are still so many other things we can learn from it, like, not this one. You will not do anything to this poor man as long as I'm here. Tell me, why would you do this for one man you don't even know? Amy paused for a second before she answered, knowing what she said could decide if they lived or died. Because while I'm still alive, humanity lives on. The two stood motionless for a full minute while the infected grunted, growled behind them. Finally, John lowered his hockey stick. All right, fine. Kill this one. There will be other chances, and when they come, I will kill you if you get in my way again. Both of them knew he meant it. John retrieved his backpack as he moved past the girl and made his way upstairs, shouting as he went. Look, we're staying here for the night, so come and find me when it gets dark. Oh, and clean the knives up when you're done with that thing. Amy let out a breath she had been holding as she turned back to the infected, raised her bat above her head. The infected looked at her with its vacant, angry stare. No comprehension, no kindness. I'm sorry, Amy whispered as she slammed her bat down on the creature's head. Yo, what is up everybody? Ceresco back again with another chapter from the story titled 50 Days After the Apocalypse, written by Rupert Rowlingson. Remember to use the links in the description below. Show love to the author, like, comment, and subscribe. Chapter 5. The day started like any other. Amy was woken up at 3 in the morning to take over watch duty. The next 4 hours were spent alternating between picking at the cracked dried stains covering her clothing and staring out at the infected milling in the street. John had told her a while back that the infected were nocturnal creatures, so it was no surprise to see numbers far greater than any Amy had seen since she had been dubbed. The woman reflected on the events of the past weeks. After the infected had broken into the campsite and almost killed the pair, John had taken to building thicker barricades so all but the most determined of infected would be turned away. The weeks had also forced the pair deeper into the city, out of the suburbs, and the safe, well-built houses into cheaper flats that took a lot longer to make defensible. Slowly, as dawn approached, the majority of infected crawled into the deserted houses, seeking the comforting embrace of the darkness to wait out the day. Amy found some small measure of entertainment watching the brainless things bounce off the barricaded door a few times before stumbling away. If it weren't for the atrocities she had seen the monsters commit, the girl would have found it comical. The sun began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky red, as if even the sky couldn't avoid bleeding. Stretching as she stood, Amy slowly crept over to her companion. Like normal, John was wrapped up in his sleeping bag, lying on his right side with a rolled up jumper acting as a pillow. Amy took aim before quickly jabbing 2 of her fingers to the sleeping man's side. John bolted upright before shooting the girl a glare as he stood and stretched. She knew it was petty, but to Amy, this one guilty pleasure was one of the few joys of her day. What followed was the usual quiet, disgusting breakfast, like usual congealed baked beans. After that, the pair broke camp, making their way out into the ghostly streets of the city. The cloudy sky painted the buildings in dark shadows that created a dark contrast with the blood-covered walls. The morning passed without incident, John leading his partner around any packs of infected that braved the sunlight in their search of prey. But in the afternoon, the duo stumbled into a supermarket. Out of fear for their safety, the pair had never ventured into any previous shops where an infected could be hiding around the shelves or in any aisles. This time though, hunger and dwindling surprise drove them forward. As the pair approached though, it was clear to see this supermarket was different. Where other shops were smashed and looted, this building had been turned into a fortress. Windows were boarded up, and there were patches of barbed wire dotted around the empty car park. Then, as the pair of the companions got closer, they realized the damaged building. The boards used to barricade the windows were splintering and covered in blood, both old and fresh. In some places, boards had even been ripped clean away. In front of the supermarket, like a sickening wall, was a mass of infected corpses piled up. At the base, some still lived and writhed in a vain attempt at trying to throw off the bodies to crawl into the store. John and Amy skirted around the obstruction, heading for the front of the store, seeking a way inside. When they finally found the opening, they almost wished they hadn't. The front door had been smashed down, and surrounding the breach was a pile of bodies, both infected and survivors. John moved inside, his partner following him. Then, the smell hit them. Rot. The putrid smell was so overpowering that it forced Amy to wheel around and vomit. Unfortunately, the spittle landed on the gutted corpse of a middle-aged man, which caused the girl to retch again. Taking deep breaths to regain her composure, the girl wiped her mouth on her sleeve, rejoined her companion. John was crouched next to one of the self-service machines, his pack resting beside him as he peered out into the all-engulfing darkness of the store. Slowly, the teen's eyes adjusted and the horror of the supermarket was revealed. The majority of the shelves had been pushed against the walls as a second line of defense, though there were few left at the back, presumably for storage. The cleared space left was used for sleeping, judging by the sleeping mats arrayed around the area. But Amy didn't see any of this. All she saw were the bodies. Men, women, young, old. They were all slaughtered in some of the most brutal ways imaginable. And the blood was everywhere, pooling on the floors and smeared across the walls. Oh my God, Amy breathed as she unconsciously took a shuddering step forwards towards the carnage. Immediately, John's hand shot out and pulled the girl back down, gesturing with the other hand in motion for her to wait. Slowly, with a slight tremble in his hand, the boy reached out and grabbed an empty can. Catching on, Amy readied her bat and slid her own pack off as John pulled his arm back and threw a can. The object spiraled once and slammed into the opposite wall with a loud clang that echoed throughout the store. Almost immediately, the infected appeared, rising from the carnage, soaked in blood. The 6 of them shuffled forward, dragging lame and broken limbs behind them. Amy couldn't help but observe how badly maimed the creatures were. More evidence of just how hard the fight here had been. Then, John moved. Hockey stick clove through the air, striking down on the closest infected in seconds. The others turned their snarling faces towards the pair, as if angered by the ambush. John didn't even flinch at the sight as he slammed the head with a hockey stick through the teeth of the next infected before braining it on the next blow. Amy leapt into action herself, killing an infected with one swing. The next infected came at her arms, raised, but as the girl brought her bat back to swing, the creature leapt forward, crashing into her. The 2 of them fell on the floor, a mass of flailing limbs in the madness. But Amy managed to jam her weapon between the monster's gaping jaw. The pair of them rolled along the floor, limbs flying around aimlessly in a struggle to gain the upper hand. Finally, the infected managed to pin Amy's hands to her side as it spat out the cricket bat. Amy struggled not to scream as the vice-like grip of the monster crushed her wrists. Before the infected could finish her off, John appeared swinging his hockey stick like a baseball bat into the thing's head, sending it flying. Amy quickly scanned for the next opponent, but was relieved to see her partner had finished them off. Letting out a sigh, the girl allowed her head to sink back onto the floor, not caring about the blood more. There was a thump as John collapsed next to her, panting. The 2 of them sat in relative silence, their heavy breathing echoing around the desolate building. Then, after a few minutes, John stood up and offered the girl a hand, as with a slight smile, said, "Come on, you don't want to get your clothes dirty." Amy wasn't sure if it was just sheer stupidity of the statement or the fact that she had once again narrowly escaped death, but she couldn't help herself as she burst out laughing. After the pair of them had recovered, they went and retrieved their worryingly empty packs before slowly making their way over to the storage shelves. That was when they found it. A treasure trove of supplies. Cans stacked on the shelves or rolling on the floor. Bottles of water were piled in one corner, and there were even a few loaves of bread and spices scattered around. The pair lost themselves in their excitement at seeing so much food after weeks of rationing close to starvation. The hours slipped by rapidly as their companions ate lunch and debated over what food to put in their packs. When their rucksacks were packed to the breaking point, the 2 of them sadly gathered up their things and left the supermarket. The pair emerged, and immediately they realized their mistake. The road was lit in the dying light of dusk, and the first stars could already be seen in the sky. But the worrying things were that the number of infected stumbling around had tripled since earlier that day. What was worse is that every misty deadeye immediately fixed on the adolescent. "Come on!" John yelled, no longer caring about stealth, and the man ran forwards as all the infected in the street began to close on the pair. Amy chased after her companion as a wall of bodies formed between them and the block of flats on the opposite side of the street. John yelled in anger as he jumped to the fray. Amy followed, swinging her bat wildly at head height, not caring what she hit. She lost track of time, caught in the rush of the fight for survival, a savage grin plastered on her face. Dodging, swinging, sidestepping, Amy lost count of how many times she narrowly avoided death by her hair's breadth, and she danced out of reach at the gnashing teeth, grasping arms. Suddenly, her companion appeared at her side, bleeding from several cuts, and his left arm hung lamely at his side. "All right, you're ready to run," John yelled, as in one fluid movement, he slid his pack down, working arm, and flung it onto the masked infected in front. The monsters were forced back as the heavy bag punched in its way through its free space behind. Amy didn't need any prompting as she sprinted through the quickly closing gap and into the closest building. John followed hot on her heels, scoping up the pack as he passed. Amy ran through a small, grubby lobby, rushing up a rickety flight of steps. Reaching the top, the girl was greeted by an infected. Reacting instantly, Amy made to swing her bat around. Almost immediately, there was an intense pain in her arms as her weapon slammed to the wall. The creature at the top of the stairs took its chance, lurching at the girl before she could recover. Suddenly, a hockey stick appeared at Amy's side, slamming her to the wall. The girl let out a gasp of pain. She hit the wall just as the creature sailed past her, tumbling down the stairs. Come on, we gotta keep moving," John yelled. Amy turned to yell back at her companion, only to see the man was already trying to fend off some of the faster infected that were following them from the street. The girl began to run again, racing up the stairs to the second floor, John right behind her. Then, as she rounded the banister leading to the third floor, Amy saw them. There were 5 infected, slowly stumbling down the stairs. Normally, the pair would have fancied their chances against the pack, but in this cramped corridor, with over 50 more infected hot on their heels, trying to force through would just be suicide. John let out an angry growl as he turned the corner to find a corridor came to an abrupt end. There was no window to break through, only one heavy door on the right wall. Running up to it, the man gave a few desperate pulls of the handle before giving up, casting his bag to one side. Amy, hold him off," John yelled. Amy, and he began to slam his lame shoulder against the door in an effort to break through. Spinning around and raising her weapon in defense, Amy stared at the corner, a mere 2 meters away, waiting for the infected. He didn't have to wait long. Their hands came into view first. Blackened in dry blood, they grabbed and clawed around the corner. Then came the rest of the body. The girl studied each of them as they came, taking in everything. Their clouded eyes, their barred teeth, their gaping, slowly bleeding wounds. Everything. Slowly, the wall of infected advanced, their arms outstretched, beckoning to her, as if to embrace her as she died. Amy shouted in rage as she launched herself into the monsters once more, losing herself in the fight for survival. Her bat seemed to blur with speed as she whipped it about, dealing a death blow with every swing, each hit punctuated by a dull slam from behind her. Amy fought as hard and ferociously as she could, but it was no avail. Slowly, she was forced back as a wave after wave of infected attacked her, piling over one another and trampling the corpses of their former comrades underfoot. There was a sudden splintering sound as at last the door's locks broke and the door swung in. Immediately, John appeared beside the girl, grasping his hockey stick, all halfway up. With one swing, the man knocked the front line of monsters back, clearing some space. Acting quickly, the pair of survivors rushed inside the room, once again grabbing John's ditched pack before slamming the door behind them, as they threw all their weight behind it in a vain attempt to keep the infected out. Clawing hands suddenly broke through the woodwork as the door began to crumble under the force of the assault. The bedroom, John said, before he bared his teeth and bit down on the closest infected hand. Annoyingly rather, and pulling back, the hand began to struggle even harder, with efforts to grab the man. With a shared nod, the pair abandoned the door, running inside the main bedroom. As John closed the door behind them, Amy toppled the wardrobe behind it to act as a small barricade. Taking advantage of the small respite, Amy doubled over, breathing heavily, only now realizing how close to collapsing she was. My arm. The girl looked at her companion as he spoke. John was sitting on the bed, holding his lame arm out towards her. When Amy didn't make a move, he elaborated, I think it's just dislocated. Look, I need you to force it back into the socket or the swelling starts. It was only then that the girl realized just how badly hurt John got clearing the way. Cuts covered his body, and his t-shirt was little more than shreds now, though thankfully there were no visible bite marks. Possibly most worrying, other than the shoulder, was a deep cut about an inch above his left eye. Already the blood pouring from it had made the eye below unusable. Stepping forwards, Amy gently took the man's arm, then she tightened her grip and pulled the limb towards her. John quickly grabbed the bed with his working hand to hold his position. When she could pull no further, the The girl reversed her hold and pushed the arm towards her companion's torso. John gritted his teeth, and his arm painfully slid back into its socket. Then it was over. John made a few deft movements to check his arm was working, before offering a small smile of thanks. The peaceful moment was shattered as the door began to shudder as the infected began to slam against the final barrier between them and their prey. Reacting immediately, the pair shouldered their backsacks, and readied their weapons. Any bright ideas, John? John was casting about the Red Room, looking for anything that could be used to save their lives. There was a terrifying crunch as the first of the bloodied hands broke through the woodwork. Come on, John, there's no rush, Amy said sarcastically. Adrenaline once more was coursing through her system as all her senses strained to reach their peak. Then, John's eyes fixed on the window. Follow me, John said, already running to the window as more hands broke through the quickly deteriorating door. With a smash, John broke the window and raced out onto the balcony, Amy out on his heels. Letting out a triumphant yell, John saw what he had been hoping for. The building next door had a balcony 1.5 meters away. Not wasting any time, the man threw his backpack and hockey stick over before jumping up onto the balcony railing. Without hesitating, John leapt the gap, tumbling onto the adjacent building. Amy quickly followed suit, tossing her bag and weapon over before quickly hopping up onto the railing. Then she did the worst thing possible. He looked down. Below was a small alley separating the two buildings. Packed inside were the masses of infected scrambling over each other like maggots, their blank, vacant eyes staring up at the girl. A wave of vertigo hit her, causing Amy to grab onto the wall to stabilize herself. For a moment, she stood there, entranced by the sight. Hurry up! John's yell broke her out of her trance as she once again set her sights on the opposite balcony. But now, the gap didn't seem like 1.5 meters. Now, it felt like miles separated her from safety. Amy took one last steadying breath as she bent her knees. Suddenly, there was a crash, and the sound of wood snapping as the bedroom door was torn to pieces, and the infected got in. Instinctively, Amy looked back mid-jump, slipping slightly on the railing. The girl flew through the air, leaving the chasing infected behind. But there was one clear thing. She wasn't going to make it. Amy outstretched her hands, desperately trying to grab the opposite balcony. Time seemed to slow, and despite of all the noise around her, Amy couldn't hear a thing as she watched the ledge of the balcony rise above her hands, and she knew this was it. This was how she was going to die. Then a hand wrapped around her outstretched wrist, bringing her descent to a bone-jarring stop. Time sped up again as noise returned to her world. Amy hung there like a puppet with all but one of its strings cut. Her feet hung just out of reach of the infected below as they snarled at her angry, their prey was so close, yet out of reach. A second hand wrapped around their wrist as slowly as the girl was pulled away from the monster. Looking up, Amy could see John's face contorted with the effort of pulling his companion up. But there was something else. Something Amy had never seen John show before. There was a trace of terror tinged in his features. Before she could think about it anymore, the girl was pulled up over the side of the balcony, collapsing on the floor in a heap with their savior. That was John was saying before he was cut off as Amy wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time since day zero, cried through his shirt. John sat there stunned for a moment before his features softened and he slowly slid his hands behind, hugging the girl back. Amy didn't cry for long as she quickly reined in her emotion. With a slight movement, she indicated she was ready to move, and the two survivors separated and gathered their things. As John reached for the handle of the bay doors, the girl held his hand back. John looked at her questioningly. Meeting his gaze, Amy spoke. "Thank you." It was two simple words, but they were all that was needed to convey all the emotions the girl was feeling. With that, Amy released her companion's hand, and the two ventured to the building. It was not easy, but the pair were able to weave their way through the building, avoiding most of their pursuers and quickly braining any that they couldn't. Finally, a full hour after they had left the supermarket, the two of them settled on the studio apartment near the top of the building. Quickly barricading themselves in, they ate a sparing meal. Neither of them had munched on an appetite after the ordeal. Amy jumped out of her skin at every little noise, panic close to driving her insane. Quietly crawling over to a wall with the view of the barricaded door, the girl, as she propped with her back against the wall, her legs curled up and back clutched tightly in her hands. Amy sort of controlled her panic breathing. Her vision focused solely on the door as the dark monsters of her mind began to claw at Amy's very sanity. An arm wrapped up around the girl's shoulder, causing her to jump. With a terrified glance, Amy looked questioningly at her companion. In response, the man tightened the one-arm hug slightly. "Don't worry. For tonight at least, I promise I'll protect you." John's words were simple, but for some reason, they worked. Amy physically relaxed, limply holding her bat in one hand, and the rest of the girl's body collapsed against John, as all the exertion Panic of the day hit her. As her eyes fluttered in a vain attempt to remain conscious, Amy realized she had laid her head on John's right shoulder. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of chapter 5. Yo, what is up, everybody? So let's go back again. Another chapter from our zombie story titled 50 Days After the Apocalypse, written by Rupert Rowlingson. Hopefully you guys have been enjoying the previous chapters. Remember to show love to the author with the links in the description. Like, comment, and subscribe. Chapter 6, Other Survivors. Amy slowly drifted awake, her eyes fluttering open, and she took in her surroundings. She was sat in the same position she had been in last night. Her hockey stick lay between her legs, where she had dropped it when at some point in the night she had fallen asleep. There was a slight movement beneath her head. Immediately returning to consciousness, Amy bolted upright, quickly looking sideways to see what had moved. On her left sat John, apparently deep in sleep. Quickly, Amy realized that she must have fallen asleep on the man. This was embarrassingly confirmed by a small patch of drool where her head would have been. As she became more awake and the memories of the previous day returned, the girl couldn't help but stare at the peaceful face of her companion. John's face was slightly haggard, not helped by the patches of stubble that dotted his chin and neck. His hair was matted, and a mixture of congealed substances gave it a gel-like effect. The cut that had almost blinded John yesterday had scabbed over, and the man had wiped the drying blood away from her eye, making it usable again. Are you watching me sleep again? Amy blushed bright red. She quickly mumbled out some weak excuse. John let a small smile slip onto his face as he opened his eyes. Trying to distract from the situation, the embarrassed girl asked, "Have you slept yet?" Grabbed a few hours sleep after dawn, once I was sure the infected wouldn't break in." At dawn? What time is it? Instead of an answer, John handed her the watch. 11:17. Amy stared at the time for a few seconds before she quickly began to crawl along the floor, gathering up all their belongings. What are you doing? Well, we have to get moving. We need to search for... Amy trailed off as she remembered what had happened yesterday, before the desperate fight. Her eyes darted over to the bulging packs stuffed to the brim, the supplies the pair had raided yesterday. Physically relaxing, Amy slowly got to her feet and stretched, working out the kinks from sitting stock still all night. John made to follow her, but as soon as he stretched, his left shoulder flared with pain, and his right hand immediately shot to it. With a shaky laugh, the man tried to brush the action off, as brushing his shoulder, but it didn't fool Amy. The girl stomped over to him, moving his hand away and ignoring his protests, as she ripped open his destroyed t-shirt to look at the injury. She gasped when she saw it. John's left shoulder was extremely swollen and was already colored purple with bruising, probably from breaking down the door. Swatting his hands away, the girl pulled the scraps of clothing off the man. Close to half of John's body was covered in bruising, and a particularly bad patch over his right ribs suggested a broken bone, too. John, we need to get you to... What, huh? To a hospital? Don't be an idiot. I'm fine. And with that, the man stormed over to his pack, rooting through it to pull out his spare t-shirt. However, as he made to put it on, John found that he couldn't lift his arm any higher than shoulder height. Amy slowly approached him as he struggled to slip the garment on, slightly placing her hand on his normal shoulder, causing the man to freeze. Let me. The girl's hands slid across John's battered body, delicately taking hold of his left arm. Ever so slowly, Amy guided his arm through the sleeve, smiling sadly as John winced. Then, the man's hand slid out of the sleeve, but the woman didn't move away. The two of them suddenly realized how close they were. Mere centimeters separated their heads as both of them stared at each other. Amy began to move forwards, closing the distance. There was a sudden bang as an infected knocked into the door, as it stumbled into the door as it patrolled the corridor. The teenagers quickly separated, the light tinge of red decorating both of their features. John coughed as he looked back at his companion. We should probably get out of here. Find a safer place to set up camp. He quickly moved over to the abandoned pile of items and began to pack them. Amy didn't respond as she silently set about the task. Within minutes, all their stuff was packed and the two were ready to leave, choosing to forego breakfast. Quietly as they could, the two of them unbarricaded the door and set off to the body of the building and out to the bloody streets still littered with the infected corpses. The day was hot. The sun scorched the blood-caked ground, producing a putrid smell that lingered in the air. Every now and then, a breeze would blow through the streets, offering a brief moment of respite in the stifling weather. The infected were hardly to be seen as they sought the cool darkness of the buildings in an effort to protect against a quick decomposing rate. John and Amy cautiously stalked the streets, still wary of ambush after yesterday. Both of the survivors were covered in sweat from a mere hour of walking in the open sun, and their tempers were starting to fray. That was when a scream of pain and terror echoed down the street. Amy took a step in the direction of the scream before she remembered the last time this had happened. She remembered Andrew Roberts and his daughter. He remembered the cruel way her partner had let him die in an attempt to further his understanding of the infected. Amy glanced at their companion. She could see the same thoughts were going through his mind. Another scream echoed down the street, more desperate now. That did it. Before John could do anything, Amy set off, sprinting through the streets. It took her 2 minutes to reach a tall building, at least 15 stories high, from which the screams were coming from. In front of the building, Amy could see a group of possibly a dozen infected crowding around an open doorway. In front of the doorway stood a boy about 14 years old, armed with a plank of wood, trying to keep the creatures out. Despite everything she'd learned since the horror began, Amy charged straight at the group. The first infected didn't even have a chance to turn around. The second didn't fare much better, as Amy forced her way through the group. The third infected lunged at her, but Amy nimbly sidestepped before bringing her bat down hard on the back of the creature's head. As the girl once again turned towards the doorway, she barely managed to lean back, avoiding a savage bite of the fourth infected. Trying desperately to back out of the thing's reach, Amy scuttled backwards, barely staying upright. But it was too slow. The infected took one long stride, grabbing Amy around the waist, raised his head to deliver a killer bite. A knife suddenly shot out from behind Amy's back, stabbing the infected through the eye, killing it instantly. The weapon was quickly pulled back, and Amy turned with it to look at her savior. John stood there, blood covering his fresh clothes, 2 more corpses behind him. Look, let's finish this first, then we'll have a long talk about safety. Amy felt her anger build at being disregarded. Turning back to the fight, she saw John, bloody knife in his left hand and the trusty hockey stick in his right, swiftly kill the 7th member of the pack. By the doorway, 2 of the infected grappled with the boy, while the 3rd attempted to stalk around the scuffle to flank the defender. Another echo screamed out the doorway. As Amy watched, the boy swung his plank sideways, knocking his 2 attackers off their feet, dealing with them the 2 swift strikes before turning to the 3rd. To the girl's right, John jumped backwards, dodging a vicious swipe of a clawed hand before using his longer reach to slam his hockey stick to the monster's temple. An animalistic smile crept onto the man's face as he watched the creature collapse to the ground, like a puppet that had its strings suddenly cut. Amy strode up to the last of the infected, tightly gripping her bat in both hands. Then, in one large swing, she released all of her anger. The creature fell to the ground, head caved in. Taking a minute to catch her breath, Amy slowly turned to face the doorway, studying the boy. He was stood just inside the doorway, still holding his large wooden plane. He had short black hair and was quite tall for his age, nearing 6 foot perhaps, already taller than Amy. But what caught her attention was his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had seen and done terrible things. The eyes of someone who was dead inside. They were the exact same eyes as Amy's companion. Another scream broke Amy out of her thoughts as John began to speak. "Look, we're here to help. Let us inside before the infected